welcome to this panel session on migration policy for Australia in the context of population ageing. So my name is Woodland. I'm one of the chief investigators at CEPAR and in economics at this university. Now, before I introduce the chairperson of the panel, I have some ground rules that I'm supposed to let people be reminded about. So I'm just indicating that this session's been live streamed online. And so welcome to all the people who are online right now. And it's a watch and listen live stream only, so for those people online, you're unable to ask questions. Questions only from this part of the audience. And I'll just remind people to use the microphones when they ask a question and speak into them so that the people online can clearly hear. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce the chairperson of the panel session, Professor Peter McDonald. Professor McDonald is a CEPAR chief investigator and a professor of demography within the Centre of Health Policy at the University of Melbourne. And prior to that, he was a professor of demography at the Australian National University. And prior to that, he was Deputy Director of Research at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. So Peter is very well known for his research on fertility, transition and migration in particular, and is frequently consulted on issues about population dynamics by governments around the world, especially in Australia, Europe and East Asia. So in 2015, Peter was awarded the Irene B. Tuber Award by the Population Association of America, which is given in recognition of unusually original and important contribution to the scientific study of population. And he's apparently only the fourth non-American to receive this award. And then in 2022, he was awarded the laureate of the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population. So these two awards, the Tobel Award and the laureate, are the two most prestigious international awards in the field of demography. And so without further ado then, I would like to hand over to Peter to run the panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alan. Now, migration policy has been very much in the news this year with the report of the independent panel's review on the migration system and associated strongly worded speeches by the relevant ministers. This panel has been planned for quite some time, and I was worried that all the policy issues would be ticked off by the time that we met and there'd be nothing much more to discuss. But fortunately, that hasn't happened. And so we're going to focus on the main policy issues that are still up for grabs. The Labor government has made some changes, but we'll neglect those primarily and focus on those still up for grabs. And if that were not enough for this year, the 2023-24 Treasury budget papers project large-scale net overseas migration in the next few years, the largest levels of net migration in Australian history. Given the relevance of migration to population ageing, the organisers of the conference thought a discussion of migration policy would be timely. As you notice, there's only two speakers here on the panel. Liz Ritchie, unfortunately, was unable to be here contracting COVID at the last moment. And she's a passionate supporter of regional migration, and so that's not going to come through quite as strongly as it would have if she was here. The two panellists remaining, Abul Rizvi, a former Deputy Secretary and the Chief Policy Honcho of the Department of Immigration, and Abul's still actively involved in advice on and comment on migration policy. And Trent Wiltshire, now working on migration policy with the Grattan Institute. And Grattan has produced 3 interesting and challenging reports on migration in the past year. Trent's an economist with considerable experience in employment and housing issues in the Victorian government and in the private sector. Now, the first issue we're going to talk about is probably the most important, but maybe the most neglected, and that is the size of the government's migration program. In relation to population ageing, the most important aspect of migration policy is the number of migrants. It's well established that the young ages of migrants and later the children of migrants make a very large difference to future population ageing. So, for example, currently 17% of the Australian population is aged 65 and over, and with no migration from now on, this would rise to 31% by 2061. But with migration around 200,000, where we're largely at, it would rise to just 23%. So 17 to 23% with migration, 17 to 31% without migration. That's assuming constant fertility. So it's surprising then that the government's recent review of migration hardly mentioned population ageing. It also mitigation of population ageing is not one of the review's specified aims of the migration program. And the review says nothing about the size of the program and how that might be determined. And the recent Grattan Institute reports also are largely silent on the size of the program. So, Abul, in the past, it was your job every year to make a recommendation to the Cabinet on the size of the program. How did you go about doing this, and why do you think that recent reviews are reluctant to address the size of the program?
I'll take the second one first, Peter. Many of you will remember that during the Howard years, and indeed during most of the 1990s, the size of the migration program and net overseas migration was kept at a relatively low level. Indeed, I remember throughout the 1990s, we kept the overseas student program as small as we could. That was actually an objective, right through the 90s. Then, in late 1990s, around 99, and from then onwards, the Howard government switched and decided we needed to have higher levels of migration. Both the migration program was increased, net migration increased steadily, and the overseas student program, as a feeder to those to migration, increased steadily from then on during the Howard years. Why did Howard change? I can assure you the key driver was a piece of work that Peter did. Peter wrote a paper which outlined why it was important to have a larger young migration program to slow the rate of population ageing. Whether that influenced Mr. Howard himself or not, I don't know. Whether he read Peter's paper, I can't be sure. It was attached to one of the cabinet submissions, I recall. But I do know the relevant minister at the time and the relevant treasurer at the time were influenced by it. In other words, the government deliberately increased the size of migration to Australia to slow the rate of ageing based on a paper Peter wrote. So looking at it backwards from today, why Mr. Parkinson's review doesn't talk much about the impact on ageing and the level of the program and the level of net migration is a little unclear. If you read the paper and read between the lines, it is clear to me Parkinson was itching to talk about the level of migration and the impact on population ageing, but did not do so. Why? Because government has fallen into this situation where it thinks talking about the long-term level of migration and its impact on population is politically taboo. In a policy sense, it's damned obvious. It's the future of Australia. Why wouldn't you talk about the future? Why wouldn't government talk about the future of Australia? But apparently talking about population invites a discussion about big Australia, and apparently both sides of Parliament don't believe in a big Australia, and both sides of Parliament refuse to define what big Australia means. But they don't believe in it. That's the important thing. Now, I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll quickly talk about the migration program for this financial year, just starting. Many of you will be aware that the headline number has been reduced from 190,000, this is for the migration program, to 195,000. But that doesn't take into account 3,000 permanent visas in what is known as the Pacific Engagement Visa. It doesn't count them because that visa is owned by the Department of Foreign Affairs, and the Department of Foreign Affairs doesn't like its visa numbers sullied by other visa numbers, so they don't get brought together. If you think that's nonsense, you're absolutely right. Secondly, as of today, around 350,000 New Zealand citizens will have a direct pathway to permanent residence without going through, a direct pathway to Australian citizenship without going through permanent residence, which means the approximately 10,000 New Zealanders who were applying and securing permanent visas every year will no longer have to apply. They'll just go straight to citizenship, which effectively means the program has 10,000 places freed up that were not available. In my view, the real level of this year's migration program is 203,000, the largest ever in our history. But despite that, because the vast bulk of the program will be delivered through people who are already here, it won't have that much of an impact on net migration.
Thanks. Trent, what's your views on the size of the program and the fact that it's ignored?
Yeah, as you said, Grattan has kind of shied away from the debate about size. We've mainly focused our work in the past few years on the skilled component of the permanent migrant intake, and really looked at the importance of, that's a relatively small part of the overall size of the overall intake. So our work shows that only 1 in 4 visas over the past 10 years are issued primarily based on the person's skills, because there's partner visas attached to skill visas too. So it's a relatively small share of the overall intake is for skilled people. So our focus has been, let's make sure we get that skilled program right. Let's do that. Let's revamp that and get that as best as we can, because that's the really important long-term fiscal and economic dividend from migration. And in terms of the size, we have said, I think, that the size will depend a little bit on economic conditions and what our competitors are doing. So obviously, if the labour market's booming here, then a larger intake probably makes sense. If the rest of the world is perhaps taking the top talent more so, the distribution of talent maybe shifted away, so maybe a smaller intake may be more appropriate. But that sort of fine-tuning, I think, as Abul just said, is not really taken into account. It's often more of a political decision about where the numbers go. And I think you saw that this year, that the number went down from 195 to 190, just that little bit less to sort of take the political pressure off, I think. But as I said, there's more sort of sitting outside that overall program. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, okay, well, I tend to agree with you, Abul, that it's all about big Australia and nobody wanting to be labelled as big Australia.
You've seen that in the opposition just the past few months, how much they've been jumping down the throat.
Yeah, exactly, yes. Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to the second issue, which was going to be Liz's issue, and that is regional migration. The 2023-24 migration program, state and regional migration streams make up 46% of the total skill stream, getting up towards half, are dedicated to locations. And that's implemented by making it a bit easier for people going to regional areas, and maybe they have to remain in a regional area for a while, but a lot of the research suggests that people who are in that kind of situation, having done their time in the regional area, head for the cities. Now, if Liz were here, she would provide a powerful defence of regional migration, let me say that. I've heard her. But Abul, what's your view?
Well, let me support Liz. But let me define regional migration slightly differently. I always thought of regional migration not necessarily as about forcing or sending people to the regions, but rather as a way of getting state and territory governments and regional authorities, call them what you will, local councils, a bigger say in the level of migration and the type of skills that they are able to attract. So, for example, if South Australia was given a larger allocation, the bulk of the people that South Australia will tend to nominate will actually go to Adelaide. Now, whether you want to define Adelaide as regional or not, it's probably in the eye of the beholder, I suspect. But Adelaide we've always defined from an immigration perspective as regional. So that was the first policy objective, to get state and territory governments a bigger say in who and what skills they needed. The second thing that comes up in this space is exactly the point Peter raises. What does success look like? Let's assume, as a result of the mechanisms that are in place, Wagga or Albury or any other iconic regional place in Australia manages to, through these mechanisms, attract a student nurse to Wagga. And the student nurse takes 3 to 4 years to get his or her degree in Wagga. They then get a temporary graduate visa, which they may be on for 1, 2, 3 years, because there's a minimum level of skilled work required before you can go to the next step. Many of those nurses would then go on to a skilled temporary entry visa. They may be on that for another 3 years. That may lead them to a subclass 491 provisional visa. They may be on that for another 3, maybe 4 years before they get permanent residence. And they may be in the regional area after that for another 2, 3, 4 years before they, as Peter said, leave for Sydney. Is that success or is that failure? I would argue that's success, because Wagga or Albury or wherever benefited from that student nurse for over a decade. Not a disaster in my view.
Trent?
Yeah, I think that's probably an example of somewhat success when that person has made the decision to do that and hasn't really disrupted their life. I guess my concern with the regional visas is people making decisions, against their long-term best interest in terms of their labour market outcomes. So if a person is studying here but sees an opportunity to move to the regions to gain points or to get on another visa that may sort of lead to PR, they might take a different job in the regions which has lower wages than they could potentially earn otherwise. So that harms that person's longer-term prospects. That's where I think using the regional visas or the migration system to benefit the regions has potential personal costs. So I was looking at the trade-offs in terms of using the visa system to achieve those regional development outcomes. There's also the trade-off or the opportunity cost of offering that type of, if we're offering a permanent visa to someone moving to the regions, typically, or the evidence shows that the fiscal dividend from that person living in the regions is much lower than, say, an employer-sponsored or points-tested visa in the cities, because typically wages are higher in the cities. So from that economic lens, the outcome is probably poorer. Just in terms of general sort of regional policy, I think if you look at what's happened since COVID, the regional areas have become much more attractive given remote work. Maybe there'd be less need to push people to the regions, given that it's relatively more attractive for a lot of people to live in coastal towns or towns sort of near capital cities where they can commute occasionally. And we're actually seeing extreme housing pressures in a lot of regional areas due to the influx of people or lack of people leaving to come to the cities. So that push to the regions may be not required in aggregate, but noting that dynamic has also created shortages of essential workers like teachers, aged care workers in the regional areas as well. So, I think it's a really tricky one. There's definitely some benefits from the sort of regional aspect, but there are personal and economic costs as well.
Okay, well, moving on. Conventionally, migrants have been assessed according to, this is for skilled migration, according to a list of skills that are in short supply in Australia. And unions and others argue that we should not be bringing in people in occupations where the demand can be met by existing Australians, or that it may have an impact on training of Australians. Now, it looks like the current Australian government will stick to this approach. Don't know yet, but with the lists being drawn up by the Skills and Jobs Australia. But the Grattan Institute's put quite a different view. And over to you, Trent.
Yeah, thanks. So the first thing, I'll just repeat that point I said at the outset, that the proportion of our overall intake that is devoted to the skilled program is relatively small in terms of the primary skilled visa holders, so about 1 in 4 visas in the past, probably a bit higher going forward. So it's about getting that skilled intake right, because that's where the big economic and potential productivity benefits from migration come from. So that's the first thing. And as Peter mentioned, we've typically had a focus on trying to assess skills and getting people to identifying where we've got skill shortages, choosing people to fill those shortages, both for permanent and temporary migration. We argue that we need to rethink about how we use skills in terms of the migration program. So for permanent spots, we don't think this skill shortage approach really makes much sense. So a person coming here on a permanent visa will be here for 30, 40, 50 years. Why do we allocate that really scarce resource, really important resource, aimed at trying to fill a skill shortage for, say, that should exist for maybe 2 or 3 years if the labour market functions well? And that's assuming we can actually identify where skill shortages are, which is extremely difficult. The government has said they're working on a new system to improve that through Jobs and Skills Australia. We're sceptical. For temporary skill migration, I think that the skill shortage approach is a better argument. You can look to do that in the short term, filling holes. But again, the issue of trying to identify those skill shortages is very difficult. So we argue for just a minimum wage threshold for employer sponsorship rather than the skills approach. Noting that the temporary program, as Abul mentioned, is an important feeder for the permanent program. So the temporary program has 2 roles: filling skills gaps and helping the labour market adjust, but also the longer term feeder to the permanent program, which has that longer term economic benefit. So if we have a more talented, younger, higher paid temporary intake, that feeds into a better permanent intake. I'll let you respond, Abul, to my comments.
You won't be surprised if I disagree.
I saw you shaking your head out of the corner of my eye.
He was trying to intimidate you.
In terms of employer-sponsored migration, governments getting involved in what skills should be targeted is nonsense. I recall writing a brief for Ruddock outlining why labour market testing was nonsense in employer-sponsored migration, and rather that we should rely on a high skill threshold plus other requirements and employer obligations. It is good the government is returning to that approach and getting rid of labour market testing in employer-sponsored migration, because bureaucrats telling employers what skills are in shortage is absolutely nonsense. But when you move on to other categories of migration, the points-tested categories, a different lens should be applied for 2 reasons. If the migration program is large, the skills targeting becomes largely irrelevant. If you look at how skills are being targeted in the skilled independent category in the last year, we were targeting everything, which is the same as targeting nothing.
Which begs the question, why bother doing it if that's the case?
Let me finish.
Yes.
Let me finish.
Yeah.
But if we're in a more normal year and places are tight, you have to start choosing. And you essentially choose by raising the pass mark. How the government delivered the larger migration program this year was by lowering the pass mark from around 90 to 95 to around 65. And 65 meant just about anybody skilled was going to get through. It didn't matter what your occupation was. At 95, it starts to matter. And the reason it is important in the short term to target your skills well is because we have a 4-year wait for social security. If you're going to bring in people who are struggling to get a job for 4 years, you have a problem. Whereas there are certain occupations in Australia that frankly have been in shortage all my life. And I suspect well after I'm dead, they will still be in shortage.
Well, a legitimate shortage or a nominated shortage?
There is a shortage of nurses, full stop, and there has been for 30 years. It's not going to change.
That's one. What about accountants is the counter-argument to that? The accountants has been on the list for
No. They've been on the list, but not in shortage. So there's two lists. One is a shortage list, and one is the list. So accountants are on the list, but at 90 pass mark the year before, accountant would struggle to get through, would not have got through. So in categories where it is government doing the selecting, it makes sense for government to target the skills of people who are going to get a job quickly, because you don't want them coming to Australia on the basis of a skill and being stuck without a job for 3 or 4 years and no money to survive.
Okay, well, let's move on from that one. The next area I was going to talk about was the partners of skilled migrants, combined with the partners of Australian citizens in the family stream, make up the largest component of the Australian migration program. But we tend to ignore this, and government has tended to ignore it, that they are a huge potential source of labour. A lot of them are quite skilled, and in the present context, where we'll talk about a bit later, where we're looking at aged care workers, for example, no discussion there that maybe the partners that I've just described might be good to work in the aged care industry. Well, I think I'll just leave that topic there so we can get on to other topics.
I'll just add, Peter, I've just got the numbers here. So in terms of those secondary holders, from 2016, about 10% of personal service workers, so mainly the care workers, are secondary visa holders. So 10% of the aged care workforce are secondary skilled visa holders and family visa holders, if not more.
They are significant now, and so it should be taken first.
And to go back to the previous topic, so that's where targeting the skilled program where we can, or making that intake really strong matters, because there's a whole bunch of people that are coming here not targeted according to their skills that fill all different parts of the workforce.
Yeah. Okay, so Abul, how large should the humanitarian program be?
Okay. First, you start with getting the numbers right in terms of what the government's actually doing as opposed to the headline numbers. So the headline number that they'll tell you is the humanitarian program is 13,500 people, but it's not actually. The actual size of the humanitarian program is about 12,000 from offshore. That's in the generic offshore humanitarian program. There's about 2,000 reserved for onshore asylum seekers, people who arrive on an aeroplane, apply for asylum and successfully get it. The third group is the special Afghan intake, which is 4,500 per annum for a number of years. I forget how many years, I think it's 3 or 4 years. And a fourth group is the people who receive temporary protection visas and will this year be provided a pathway to permanent residence onshore. That's about 19,000 people. Now, the government's saying they're not part of the humanitarian program. But shouldn't everyone who gets a permanent visa at some stage be counted as part of the permanent intake? These people, when they got a TPV, didn't get counted as part of the permanent intake. They're now going to be getting a permanent humanitarian visa and are still not going to be counted. That's nonsense. In effect, the size of the humanitarian program in 23-24 will be bigger than ever in our history. Okay, then you come to the question, how do you set the size of the humanitarian program? Fundamentally, it's about how generous Australia wants to be. And Australia in some years has been more generous than in other years. Looking at it through the eyes of a bureaucrat, whenever a minister has said to me, I want to increase the size of the humanitarian program, I've said, that's fine, Minister, but you will have to find the offsets because the Department of Finance won't allow you to grow the humanitarian program until you have found the offsetting savings. and the relevant minister rarely found the offsetting savings, and so the humanitarian program rarely grew. The offsetting savings argument remains in place. So growing the offshore humanitarian program, the biggest challenge is how can you grow it in a manner that provides the relevant individuals with a reasonably rapid pathway to employment. That's the big challenge. There are a number of programs being trialled at the moment which are showing some level of success, which may start to change the numbers in terms of their employment outcome. But unless you can change their employment outcome quite considerably in the first 4 years after arrival, you're faced with the Department of Finance problem. And many people say, well, who cares what the Department of Finance says? Unfortunately, if you're a bureaucrat, it matters.
Okay, well, the world of the labour market out there has changed a lot, and there's high demand these days in a lot of lower skilled jobs. And the new government is responding to that through various programs to bring in new low-skilled permanent migrants. And one in particular of great interest to this audience is the Aged Care Industry Labour Agreement. What do you think of the Aged Care Labour Agreement and conditions, the risks, etc.? Trent?
Yeah, we think it's needed given the workforce shortage in the sector. Clearly, the aged care sector is under a lot of pressure and a lot of vacancies. So in the short term, this sort of stopgap measure is needed. Clearly, the long-term solution is higher wages to attract more people to the sector and retain them as well, to sort of really show the value of the workforce clearly being underpaid for way too long. And it's promising that those wage rises are happening. It might take a little bit too long, but it is happening. So that's the positive side. But that's going to take a while to actually solve these shortages. So yeah, this type of visa is needed in terms of the design. So that there are risks around this type of visa. So bringing in sort of lower paid workers potentially that are potentially prone to exploitation. That's one of the clear risks. So one of the design features is strong links to union involvement. So that's got criticism from business, but I think it is needed to reduce that risk of exploitation, because we know it is a significant problem across the whole economy. Potentially other design risks around it that looks like, given there's accelerated pathways to permanent residency from the visa, I think it's 2 years rather than 3 years, lower English language requirements, so it's going to be, in terms of visa integrity risks, there's going to be, it's attractive for people to potentially try and get into this labour agreement. So, you might see some students dropping out and trying to undertake Cert 3s to get into the aged care sector and take advantage of the visa. Potentially, that's like a potential risk. In terms of what it means for the overall program, well, if this visa, say these spots displace some other higher skilled workers, there'll probably be an economic cost. But if it's an additional visa to the permanent intake, that will, particularly if they're younger people coming in, that will have a long-term fiscal benefit. That's sort of the key economic benefit. That's a very narrow lens in terms of what this visa will be. But broadly we think it's needed, but there are some risks. But the design seems pretty good, I think. Sorry, one more thing. I think the risk more broadly from this visa is that the government's talking about a 3-tier system in terms of the temporary skilled visa program. A very highly skilled, high-paid sector where there's going to be maybe no occupation lists, a sort of middle tier that might operate as it currently does, and then this lower skilled tier that basically is just the aged care visa at the moment. The risk is that there'll be industry lobbying to get this visa expanded to other sectors. So that's a big risk that'll get pushed to particularly hospitality and some others where we've seen that exploitation is rife, and the TSS visa has not been used as a skilled visa. It's really a low skill visa. So that's probably another big risk of the aged care visa.
Okay, Abul, you'll have some thoughts on this, I'm sure.
Yes, I suffered through some of these. Trent is right. We absolutely need an aged care labour agreement. The involvement of the unions in it, really good idea. Absolutely essential. In fact, I would have gone further and given the unions an even stronger role and really upset the aged care industry. I would have had them tearing their hair out. But I think that's the only way to protect the workers. It's the only mechanism that actually has ever been successful in protecting migrant workers. Strong unions, and I would have given them a formal role. But the big issue here is going to be, put yourself in the position of an overseas student who's here in Australia. Let's say you're 1 year into a degree in something or other, paying pretty high tuition fees, limited work rights, huge cost of living increases, rent costing a bomb. If you're going to get through all of that, you need to get to permanent residence quickly. And if I was a student doing a 3 or 4 year degree, I would be very tempted by a short, relatively cheap Certificate 3 course in aged care that gets me a job with an aged care provider, hopefully not exploited, but the risk is there. 2 years on that visa, and I've got permanent residence.
Off you go.
And I'm out. Why wouldn't I do that? These are intelligent people. They're not dumb. They can see the obvious pathway available to them. Frankly, 2 things I would have done that I don't think the government has done in this space. One, I would have been very careful about how aged care courses are accredited. The regulator in this space is not known to be particularly hairy-chested. In fact, I would call them a relatively weak regulator. The second thing I would have done would be to look very carefully at the pathways to permanent residence and how I manage those and how the skills assessing body did its assessments. I think taking another 3, 4, 5, 6 months to get the design right on something so important would have been time well spent. My fear is at the moment they didn't spend the time. They rushed into something that's desperately needed, but rushing never works.
Okay, well, let's jump ahead a bit and let's start talking about the recent Treasury estimates of very high levels of net overseas migration in the next few years. And the Migration Review report takes the view that Australia should plan migration, this is quote, plan migration based on net overseas migration rather than simply relying on permanent migration caps. And what they're suggesting is putting caps on temporary migrant arrivals. And to quote again from the report, for example, growth in the student visa program may need to be offset by a reduction in the temporary skills program, were the NOM target to be unchanged. Now, that particular statement I regard as utterly absurd.
I agree, Peter.
And an absurd notion. But, and my view is that you control the temporary population through departures, not through arrivals. So what do you think, Abul?
I agree, Peter. Capping temporary programs has never worked. I think I'm the only public servant who's ever capped a temporary program.
There is...
I used to cap working holiday makers for a while.
Work and holiday,
yeah,
not working holiday makers, but work and holiday.
They're capped as well.
Yeah, yeah.
But in the early 90s, I remember we capped working holiday makers. That didn't work. It just created a mess. It's much better to manage temporary entry through policy, get the policy settings right, and you get the numbers right. Much better way of doing it. Controlling net migration from year to year, really, really difficult. It will naturally fluctuate with the labour market and with policy settings.
Student arrivals have ranged from 60,000 to 160,000 in the last decade.
Yep. So it will fluctuate. It will fluctuate from year to year. But that's not to say it is wrong for the government to have a view on the level of net migration it will plan for the next decade or 2 decades.
But we do. The Treasury projections are based on net migration.
They are, but Treasury's projections, as you'll notice, are explicitly stated in the government's statements are not policy. They are merely the prognostications of a bunch of relatively junior public servants who forecast net migration. Let's be frank, their record's pretty ordinary.
So is everybody else's.
Well, they could have done a bit better than from 40,000 to 400,000. I mean, you know, that's barn door stuff. They could have got a bit closer than that. I think it is important for the Australian government to have a view on what long-term net migration it wants and to plan accordingly, because the benefits of that in terms of better decision-making at all levels of government across the full range of government service delivery and across business has significant advantages if the government has a view. At the moment, the government says, we have no view. Yes, there are these public servants who have a view, but that's their view and it's not our view. But you've published it in the budget papers. How can it not be your view?
Okay, I want to jump to the final issue. Now, a frequent objection to migration is that it causes problems for infrastructure and for housing. And so what's your take on this, on those objections, Trent?
Yeah, well, I think it's clear that some Reserve Bank modelling and others show that clearly more migration can mean higher housing costs. And that's pretty clear simply because we don't build enough housing quickly enough to respond to more people coming here. So the RBA ran a counterfactual model, and it said that if you ran our actual migrant or population growth over the decade to 2018 compared to what it was previously resulted in real rents being 9% higher than otherwise. So it's clear that migration can boost housing costs, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't run a strong migration program because of the social and economic benefits from running that. So what does it mean? It means improving our housing policies to deal with this. But when you actually think about the result of what it means, that more migration, more population growth means higher housing costs, higher rents. It's actually more of a distributional game within Australia. So people benefit from that. Homeowners benefit from higher prices and higher rents, but the losers are the renters and the would-be homeowners that are going to be paying higher prices. So it's this distributional game, and to help those people at the bottom of the distribution who are the big losers, that means big investment in social housing and Commonwealth rent assistance to support them. But the main game is improving housing policies. That's Grattan's view is boosting or changing planning restrictions so that we can build more housing, particularly in our major cities, particularly in Sydney, I would say. Melbourne and Brisbane maybe done a bit better job, but also in the regions, as I mentioned before, there's significant pressure in regional housing markets. The opportunity to expand housing supply in those regional areas is a lot simpler than the difficulties about infill housing in Melbourne and Sydney in particular. So that's one thing that really should be done. And the risk is that if the government doesn't address the housing problem, then there will be public pushback against running a strong migration program, and that will have significant economic costs. So migration is a big economic lever. So we did some modelling and said, if we cut back our migration program by, say, 10,000, the permanent intake by about 10,000 people, that's like tens of billions of dollars foregone fiscal revenue or government revenue from these fewer young, skilled people arriving. So if we don't get housing right, then I think there will be a pushback against housing. So going back to the previous conversation about what do you do about temporary migration? Well, I think as Abul said, it's capping programs doesn't really work, but you can do things to improve them. So we've said the Working Holiday Maker program has sort of become a de facto low-skill farm work visa for a lot of people. So you could scrap the specified work requirement that forces people into the regions to work. You could fix some of the integrity issues in higher education at the lower end there, that people coming here doing pretty low-value courses. That's potentially another way that you could cut back on temporary migration a little bit. So that might address housing. The government sort of hinted that. But yeah, the real thing is addressing that housing on the supply side is the key thing.
Okay, well, we've reached a time where I think we need to take questions from the audience. And I have to put my hand up like this because of these lights. So, roving microphones, any questions out there? If there's no questions, we'll keep we'll keep talking. We can talk for another hour. So, no, still can't see any takers. Yeah. We might drop back to that issue about working holiday makers. It is pretty clear, I think, that the government is going to move away from the requirement of working holidays. With working holiday makers, you can come for 12 months. You can get another year if you spend 88 days working on a farm or in a regional area, and then even a third year again if you work another 88 days. But the whole thing is ridden with exploitation, including sexual exploitation, and is highly problematic. And the government seems to be moving towards the Pacific Island alternative, that is, having the Pacific Islanders doing the farm work and removing the working holiday makers altogether. The review suggested restricting the working holiday maker visa to just 1 year, which means that would take care of what we've just been talking about. I think it probably should be 2 years rather than 1 year, because...
Other than for Brits, for which it's going to be 3 years.
Beg pardon?
Other than for Brits, for whom it's going to be 3 years.
Yeah,
We've just signed a trade agreement making it 3 years.
Right.
But most countries only offer 1 year to us, so it's a reciprocal relationship typically with other countries, and most offer only 12 months with no chance of renewal for our... the aim of the Working Holiday Maker program was about cross-cultural exchange, coming to see Australia and vice versa overseas, but as you said, it's morphed into this low-skill visa.
The blurb on the Department of Home Affairs website about this visa says absolutely nothing about cultural stuff. It's about a holiday in which you're able to work, but there's nothing about learning about Australian culture.
Yeah. When Whitlam established it, he talked about culture.
Right, okay. So we need to go back a long way in history then.
We are inching back to a long way in history. Look, with immigration policy, I remember describing it to a minister as like a ball of plasticine. You push in one area, and it usually comes out somewhere else in an area you never anticipated. Yes, there's exploitation associated with the 88-day rule for working holiday makers. The big advantage of using working holiday makers in this way is that, as a whole, they are much quicker to complain than other temporary entry categories. If you look at the rate at which working holiday makers raise complaints, it's actually quite high. Now, there's two ways to interpret that. It's to say they must be heavily exploited because they're complaining a lot. Or the other is they're clever young kids who know how to complain.
90% of them in Australia at the moment come from Europe.
And they complain quite easily. They complain quite quickly. By shutting down that area, which many view as a problem, and shifting to the Pacific Island visa, just because the Pacific Island visa doesn't have a lot of complaint doesn't mean there isn't exploitation. And you can tell that there's exploitation because of the rate at which they, quote, abscond from their employer. Now, the government deliberately uses the word abscond in order to make it sound as if it's their fault that they ran away. They ran away because they were being exploited. What would you do if you were being exploited? Yes, they didn't complain, mainly because they don't have much English and they don't have much agency to complain. But that doesn't mean they're not being exploited. They're being exploited, they're running away, and then they're applying for asylum. If I was to ask you the question, which is the biggest source of asylum seekers in Australia, Pacific Island nations, India or China, which would you pick?
Okay. Question?
Go to the opposite end of the socioeconomic scale. I think I saw some stats recently that we were the largest beneficiary of high net worth migrants last year. Now, the suspicion clearly is that many of them are taking advantage of our the non-existence of much of our money laundering legislation on property developments. And one can clearly see the impact in some high-income areas in Sydney, where people are capable of buying cash and one's got to suspect things are happening. Any idea of how big that is, this is as an issue? And what's the impact going to be on our level of public morality if we are actually importing criminals of various sorts? Wealthy criminals.
You want me to go first? Yeah. I remember, this is going back a bit, sorry about that. I remember a report in '89 where we started for the first time going down the business skills route, where essentially we were just targeting rich people and we weren't too fussed about what they did as long as they were rich. The department got an almighty thrashing over that after an audit report showed we were just essentially facilitating money laundering. That program got closed down. We re-established a program where we only gave business skills visas to people who actually were running a business in Australia that employed a minimum number of people, had a minimum level of turnover. That remained the case until about 2012, when the former Labor government introduced an investor visa, where you didn't have to actually run a business or employ Australians, you just had to invest some money in an investment vehicle. Initially, it was some sort of government-designated investment vehicle, gradually got expanded, and I believe where we are now is a situation where the government is nervous for exactly the reasons that you are outlining. It has reduced the size of the business skills program quite considerably, but it has a massive backlog of applications, and I don't think it knows what to do with them. I would get rid of it for the same reasons we got rid of it in the early 90s.
Yeah, the government's cut the numbers for the Business Innovation Investment Program visa quite a lot, and we think that's a good thing because it's, well, for some people it's been used as basically a backdoor family visa in some ways. So a wealthy person can buy a permanent visa by investing a certain amount of money. In reality, Australia is an open economy. We don't really struggle to attract investment so much, so we think it's a poor way to target our scarce number of skilled visas. It's better. And the business investor visa holders are typically older, have poorer labour market outcomes, poorer English language skills, so it's much better to target these to younger, skilled people.
There's a question over there, is that right?
It seems clear that there's a shortage of workers within aged care residences and within caring for older people in general. This relates to some study that I've been doing. It seems from what I've researched so far that there's a lot of workers who are of Nepalese descent. Was that an intentional program that was implemented, or was it just a case of perhaps students getting stuck here, for want of a better word, during COVID? Or is it something that continues? It seems that each person that I've spoken to, when they talk about the staff ratios in the aged care residences, that most of them are of Nepalese heritage.
Yeah, a lot of the Nepalese in aged care are what I was talking about previously, that they're partners of people who gain permanent residence. But the Nepalese stream does come from students. That there was a huge, we had Indians and Chinese, but then Nepalese is the third biggest category, and very big in population terms. So it stems from the student movements. And that does raise some interesting issues. Now, I thought that, well, we've had a big increase in student visas recently. And I had a bit of a look, and there are some new countries emerging. It would be good if, student visas reached a kind of peak and stayed at that level. But in recent times, there's big increases from Colombia, from Bhutan, from Kenya, from Nigeria, and that actually, I think, has a potential to push student visas even higher. Don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, oh, you're right. Bhutan is the 6th largest source of overseas students to Australia. Bhutan has a population of 800,000. I'm not sure how many young people are left in Bhutan. And that predominantly is a function of work rights. We converted the student visa into an unsponsored, low-skill work visa and not a student visa. And now the government is going to have to find a way of overcoming that. As part of that, we introduced what is called the Special COVID Subclass 408, where a large number of students, predominantly students, but to some degree working holiday makers, switched to this COVID visa. The final figures are not yet out, but I suspect the number of people on this new COVID visa will be over 100,000. I don't think the government has a policy on what happens to them. Their COVID visa will expire in 12 months, gradually. What happens to them after the 12 months is up? My suspicion is large numbers will do the Cert 3 in aged care.
Is the 408 still operating, isn't it? Has it been shut down?
The government didn't make a formal announcement. I suspect it didn't want to make a formal announcement to minimise the risk of a rush out of student visas. I suspect we'll find out the policy in the next week.
We just on the Nepalese workers. So yeah, we've seen a big shift in terms of international student numbers to people from South Asia, and the survey evidence shows that South Asian prospective students really highly value post-study work rights. Our temporary graduate visa has become a bit more generous in terms of post-study work rights, so I think we'll see that trend continue even more so. So it's not just the working rights during study period, which is unrestricted during COVID. The caps just come back in, except for in aged care. But I think it's the post-study work rights as well. So it's a stepping stone to that. So that's another factor.
Any more questions? Yeah, just one other point in that regard is that the recent migration review tends to favour students as a source of permanent migration rather than temporary skilled workers, as I indicated in the quote that I gave. And to me, that's not a good idea. So if you look at, one of the main reasons is that international students in Australia actually end up with a pretty narrow range of skills, that about 60%, two-thirds almost, get degrees in business, commerce or IT. And so if we're wanting people in business, commerce and IT, that's great. But I've always been a very strong supporter of the temporary skilled migration visa as a way of getting really skilled new permanent residents. What do you think, Abul?
I always viewed the skilled temporary visa as the fulcrum of Australia's visa system. It was the method by which we got highly skilled people and then provided them with a pathway to permanent residence. We attracted the people either from overseas or students who studied the right things in order to get the skilled temporary visa. So it wasn't government targeting what they studied, it was employers effectively, because they had to go through that fulcrum. My fear is the government is moving away from that as the fulcrum and is moving into temporary graduate visas. People will say, well, isn't that wonderful? You don't have to have the restrictions of the temporary skilled visa. Well, yes and no. The temporary skilled visa also has a large number of protections which temporary graduates don't. There are no employer sponsorship obligations in temporary graduates. There's no actual employer involved. You just get the visa. There's no minimum salary requirement. Outside one of the two streams, outside the vet stream, there's no skills test. Is that the right way to go? I mean, if we thought skilled temporary entry visas were vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, why would you shift the system to a temporary visa that had even less protections? Doesn't make sense to me.
Yes, I agree. So, okay, we've reached our time. There's another question somewhere, is that right? We better take it.
Yeah, sorry. So just a question on the recent budget measure and what was the election commitment to increase the TSMIT, the Temporary Skilled Migration Income Threshold. Just any thoughts on that and how it might play out into the future of raising what's effectively the minimum wage for temporary skilled migrants?
Yeah, I can go. I was going to say that's probably one of the biggest changes to the temporary program is that change. So the minimum pay for temporary skilled workers has gone from 53,900 up to 70,000 from 2 days ago. So, you know, a big jump in a short period of time. We'd been calling for that just because the threshold had remained the same since 2013, so it hadn't been linked to wages growth. If it had been linked to wages growth, it would be about where it is now, so 70,000, so it seems about the right level. There are going to be, you know, difficult transition costs for some businesses that are facing, or employees who are on relatively low wages trying to reach that threshold to get their next visa. So we might see people move into different visa classes if they can't reach that 70,000 threshold. That's a risk. Regional areas might struggle a little bit, given that regional wages are typically lower. So, you know, I could see an argument for a discount for legitimate regional areas, not just outside Sydney and Melbourne. And then the other one is, for this room, is, you know, aged care nurses would struggle to reach that threshold as well. So
The threshold won't apply to aged care nurses?
No?
No.
Okay, well that's good.
The aged care labour agreement gives an exemption to enable you to pay aged care workers less.
Only if you're on the labour agreement though, not by the TSS.
Well, why would you come any other way?
Okay, well, I think we're past time, so we'll leave it there. So can you thank Abul and Trent for this very interesting panel?